Broomfield. We have Pete Dunleavy with us also, who's our Open Space and Trails Manager, and Jack Pritchard, who's our Open Space and Trails Specialist. And they work very hard on coexistence with our coyotes in Broomfield and our residents. And so I just wanted you to be able to have a name with a face there. We really appreciate the work they do with our residents to help build understanding about our coyotes. Tonight, we have two amazing women who are going to speak to us about Coyotes of Broomfield. And they've been doing research and beautiful drawings, and they blended these two things together into a wonderful book for our community. So I am very thankful for that. I'd like to introduce Joelle Cicak and Emily Beam. There are two researchers that have prepared the book for Broomfield, and I wanted to just ask them to talk a little bit about their education and why they selected our community to do this research very briefly, and then we'll jump into the presentation. So thanks for being here, Emily and Joelle. We're really happy you're joining us this evening. Emily, you want to start?
Sure, I can start. Hi, I'm Emily Beam. I will talk a little bit more about my background in the talk, but just for some context, I did my undergrad education in the southeastern United States. I was at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. I'm originally out of Atlanta. And then I came here to Colorado, and in the process, I've gotten my master's and I'm on my way to a PhD. And the reason that I have loved to work in Broomfield is that it's a really good hub of collaboration. And I think that it's such a great opportunity to get to work specifically with open space and trails. And also Pete and I were talking about this a little bit. Broomfield does have a little bit of a history of having some really famous coyote researchers here. So it's always nice to kind of walk in the shadow of giants. But other than that, I will pass it off to Joelle.
All right, thank you, Emily. My name is Joelle Cicak, as Kristen said, and I am the artist side of this collaboration. I got my undergraduate degree from Dickinson College, which is a very small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, where I majored in art practices, and I actually minored in classical studies. Yes. And then I came here afterwards to the University of Colorado Boulder for my master's in fine arts and ceramics, and I'll be graduating this spring, actually. And Emily was the one who, Emily was the one who actually got me involved with the Broomfield community. We decided to collaborate together on this project specifically, and it was my introduction into the Broomfield community. And it introduced me to all these wonderful people at Broomfield Open Spaces and Trails, and it is a really wonderful community, and I'm very happy to have been a part of this project. So thank you all for being so wonderful.
Well, we're really glad you chose to do your research and your art in Broomfield. That means a lot to all of us. I also wanted to note that the presentation tonight is also jointly put on with our Broomfield Open Space Foundation. And these are local Broomfield residents that really help to support our programs and our projects through funding and volunteers, and also just offer us many creative ideas on what we can do to improve our work for the community. Chris Simmons is our president of our board. And unfortunately, he had a last minute issue come up and was not able to be here tonight. But he sends his thanks to Emily and Joelle for attending and presenting. With that, I want to turn it over to our two speakers, but I also want to let you know that I think it would be helpful to them if we could keep the questions until the end of the presentation. I think that would work best for our presenters. So if everybody can cooperate with that request, that would be wonderful. With that, Jake, if you can start or begin the presentation, that would be wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
All right. I want to double check. Can you guys see the presentation? Okay, I see a thumbs up from Joelle.
Yes.
Good enough.
Yes.
Right.
As long as I can see it, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Well, hello. Like we've already said, I am Emily Beam, and together with my partner, Joelle Cicak, we will be presenting Coyotes of Broomfield. Let me see if I can move the little videos. Awesome. So at the very least, we all know where we are. I wanted to go over what we'll be talking about tonight. So we wanted to start with an acknowledgement of thanks for a host of important people and entities that really helped us start and complete this project. Then Joelle will tell us about her background, and I'll tell everyone about mine. And after that, I'll describe the study that was conducted in Broomfield in the summer of 2019. And Joelle will talk about how that study led to the book Coyotes of Broomfield. We're hoping to finish up with ample time for questions and some community discussion.
All right, so before we begin, we would like to say thank you to everyone who helped us on this project. So a big thank you to the people of Nest for making this project possible. So thank you to Jorge, Aaron, Tara, and Joanne for all of your support and aid. We would also like to thank the Environmental Studies program at CU Boulder because they provided, all of the support we needed in order to actually do this research, especially on Emily's side of things. And we would like to thank the Broomfield Open Spaces and Trails for having us here tonight and for helping us to work with for being so open and allowing us to work with them and trying to get this book to the public. We're currently figuring out how to create an event at the library in the summer once it starts to open up again. So thank you to you all. And I would like to give a special thank you to Marina Cassianadu, who's a professor at CU Boulder, for teaching me how to use InDesign, since I had definitely forgotten and I needed to use it in order to format this book, as well as her impeccably timed painting seminar, which focused on the artist book and gave me some much needed information on what artist books are and what they can look like. So thank you to Marina, especially.
We also wanted to extend our gratitude to Dr. Joanna Lambert, who is my academic advisor at CU Boulder. Dr. Stuart Breck has been absolutely integral to this project, and we will actually speak more about him a little bit later. I wanted to extend thanks to my master's thesis committee, which included Drs. Carol Westman, Dr. Sharon Collins, and Dr. Chris Schell, who is currently of UW-Tacoma, but is moving to Berkeley. Also, Dr. Joel Berger at CSU has been really helpful in providing feedback that ultimately helped craft this research. Joelle and I both are incredibly grateful to Jim Kennedy, who is a member of this community and an absolutely fantastic coyote watcher. I still think Jim should go back for a PhD, but that's just me. I think that you certainly have the hours in the field for sure. We also wanted to extend thanks to the field assistants that spent their summers unpaid, volunteering their time to this project. And those were Sam Angelides, Cliff Adamczyk, Nicole Schroeder, and Zachary Schwartz.
All right. So before we begin, I wanted to just give you a little bit of a background into my practice before we begin talking about the project, the Coyote project, that is. So as I said earlier, I will be graduating this spring with a master's in fine arts in ceramics from the University of Colorado Boulder. And although my degree is in ceramics, I am a multimedia artist. And basically all that means is I work with different materials depending on the series or the project and its conceptual needs as well as its subject matter. So a lot of the time I am working with ceramics, but obviously for this project, for the Coyote project specifically, I was working with watercolors. So regardless of the material used to create these projects, my work has always focused on animals and environments and the relationships we have with them. In some capacity. And this has ranged from the intensely personal relationships we have with our pets to the cultural relationships we have with wild species. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what that looks like and how that manifests within the work, and how that really can take different turns depending on what that relationship is and what it looks like. So I wanted to start with this project titled The Tattered Tales, which was a series of 8 manatee tales made in ceramics that were intended as portraits of individual manatees. So manatees are actually identified by the scarification patterns on their backs and tails. And this information is part of a database called MIPS, the Manatee Individual Photo Identification System, which researchers and conservationists use to identify manatees throughout their practice. And this is a really accurate way of identifying manatees, because almost every manatee living in our country's water has scarring patterns that are so distinctive that they can be tracked by them. About 4% of adult manatees do not have significant scarring patterns. So only 4%, it's a pretty reliable system. Even so, it is important to note that all of these scars are caused by human interference. So boats, canal locks, fishing line and wire, as well as other debris and detritus, and even diseases caused by eutrophication, such as red tides that eat away at their skin. All of these are caused by humans. So I felt this was a really important thing to point out within this project and in this series. Something that's really interesting about manatees is they all have these very cute names, like Lenny or Flash or Merlin. So this is Lenny. And yet they all carry these battle scars from these interactions that they have not been evolved, or that they have not evolved to face. So when I made this series, manatees had just been removed from the endangered species list a few months prior to the series creation. They had been downlisted to threatened after an aggressive lobbying campaign by land development agencies. And when looking at these animals, you may think that their greatest threat is boat strikes because it's the most obvious on their skin, but it's actually loss of habitat due to land development that is the greatest threat to them. So these two pieces of information together are very telling. And this past year has actually been one of the most deadly for manatees. And I mean, this past year is 2021. A year that is only 3 months old. Over 500 manatees have already been found dead. And it's because they're starving from seagrass die-off due to eutrophication and pesticide buildup entering the waterways from farms and lawns, developed lawns and golf courses. So there are a few laws making their way through Florida's Congress right now, and that will help protect seagrass. If you want to make a call, I encourage you to do so. Because they're a species that is on the brink. But this series as a whole was an example of attempting to point out a conservation issue that we as a country are actively grappling with. Manatees are often used as a symbol of what an endangered species looks like. They're seen as this homogeneous group instead of as individuals. After they were downlisted, they were incorrectly kind of pointed to as what an endangered species looks like that we saved, because obviously we have not saved them. And I wanted to make this series an attempt to point out that these are individuals. These are portraits of individual manatees whose lives are hard won through this trauma that they're facing. Yes. So you may be thinking, but coyotes aren't endangered and they can be dangerous in a way that manatees never will be dangerous. So we can't really interact with them in a similar way. And this is very true, and I agree with you there. But however, I would respond that it is an artificial notion that we as humans are separate from the environments that surround us. Western tradition teaches that this separation, this man versus nature idea, but it's not the only way of viewing our relationship with nature. It takes someone learning to recognize that this is only one of many ways of viewing, and perhaps that this separation is not a very good one. But after we realize this, after we realize that even coyotes are as much a part of our natural community as songbirds, for example, we can start to embody a more sustainable and holistic model of viewing our shared spaces. Obviously, we can't treat coyotes the same way as we treat songbirds, and we should never feed wild coyotes, so please do not do that. But it is something that it feels very freeing once you start to realize that you're a part of the environment that you exist within. So I would like to also show a series which is also in ceramics and is in fact my thesis work that focused on this very thing, this existing within nature. So I was indoctrinated into this ideology at a very young age. I grew up living on a piece of land that straddled suburbia and an unmanaged government-owned greenbelt in Pennsylvania. And my parents, when they moved onto this property, decided that they didn't like that delineation between suburbia and this piece of forest, so they started to pull that natural space into the land that we lived on. So they de-lawned the lawn before the notion was popularized. They planted a bunch of trees, and they really surrounded us and created an extension of this forest. And the animals came and embedded themselves within this landscape. We have had all of these wonderful, beautiful experiences of watching these animals interact with each other and interacting with the landscape. Some of them are heartbreaking and some of them are really, really sweet. And so this series focused on 5 memories that I have of this space, 5 important foundations to my life that were formed from listening and looking closely, but keeping a respectful distance as well. So this piece specifically is one that I wanted to talk about. It's titled Seeking Hiding, and it focuses on a memory of a bush that was in that backyard that was always completely full of birds, to the point they were extremely loud. They were always calling to each other and calling, outside of the bush. They were moving around so rapidly within the space that the leaves of the bush would actually shake, but they were impossible to see through the foliage. And it was a really amazing experience and realization to learn through watching this bush. We could go up to it closely and the birds would not quiet. They would not still. They were not afraid of us at all. They were happy to exist alongside us within this environment. So it was this really wonderful realization to be able to exist beside this bush full of birds that you can hear but cannot see. And you have to be all right with this knowledge that they are there, that they're there where they want to be, and that they feel comfortable existing beside you. So finally, I did want to look at a very personal series, one which individualizes the animals that we do care for, the ones that we keep within our homes, our pets. So A Hat for Every Fish I Owned, ongoing, is a sister series to Offerings to Dead Pets. If you could advance the slide one more. Thank you. And both of these series look at the animals that I have personally cared for throughout my life and pays tribute to them. Offerings to Dead Pets was conceived after a series of bad dreams that I had about these animals, which sounds kind of odd. Some of them had been deceased for over a decade at the time of these dreams. And I am very lucky, I don't have bad dreams. So this was very strange. And I decided that I needed to work through this occurrence within my practice. So I decided to make an offering of food to each of them based upon what would have been a special treat to them in life, or a food that I had a specific memory of feeding them. Thank you. So what I did was I made a ceramic altar for each animal that I have had in my life, and then I placed food on top of the altar and fired them in the kiln. And the kiln gets hot enough that the heat actually pretty much vaporizes the food, leaving this really, really fragile, delicate white residue behind. And sometimes it even would flash a very delicate color onto the altar. So if you look really closely, you can see that there's a little bit of orange around that white residue. So this piece specifically was to a toad that I had growing up, and I think some of you probably can relate to this. If you have a lot of pets, people tend to think that you can have one more and it's fine and they can just give them to you. So this toad was actually given to us by a friend of my sister's. His father had run over it with a lawnmower, unfortunately, and her leg was kind of not working well anymore, but otherwise she was okay. So we decided to keep her and care for her because she didn't seem like she would be able to be re-released. And I would catch grasshoppers for her and feed them to her. So the food on this altar were grasshoppers, though I did buy a can of dead grasshoppers for this project. I did not feel comfortable killing grasshoppers for the sake of this project. And the point of making this was that it was a way of bringing these animals back into my present reality, of remembering them and enacting and embodying this act of care, and continuing to enact this care even after they were gone. For every fish I've owned, however, did function a little bit differently. So it was a look at the way we culturally treat fish as decorative objects rather than living creatures. And I know that some of you probably have these awesome aquariums, either with a goldfish or maybe, you know, a ton of tropical fish, and you treat them well and you love them, and they're very important to you. And I think that's awesome and good, like, that's great. But we have to remember that culturally, we do see fish as something that's easily replaced, their starter or practice pets, rather than something that has the right to exist just because it does exist. So I made these tiny hats for each fish that I've owned in my life, hand knitted with sewing thread and sewing needles. As you can see from this slide, they are quite small, about the size of an index fingernail. And the point was that we knit objects for those who we love. The act of knitting is an act of devotion to this relationship. And I wanted to partake in an act of devotion, regardless of how absurd it was. And yes, this series is a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more leaning into absurdity than the offerings to dead pets. And partially that was purposeful because it's an absurd act to knit a hat for a fish, as they do not have any use for them, and doubly so since these fish are no longer living. And in that, it becomes an act of atonement that can never really be forgiven, right? Because I did have transgressions growing up and learning how to work with fish and have fish, right? I did sometimes treat them more like decorative objects than living animals. And this was a way of not just saying, I'm sorry, but also a way of making an oath that if I ever do own fish again, that I will not treat them that way. But again, it was a way of bringing them back into my present reality, remembering each one as an individual, as a life lived, and as a meaningful life lived. So I hope that gives you a good overview of the different ways that these relationships can take form within artwork. And I think that lays a good groundwork for when we talk about the coyotes and how that project needed to be addressed specifically as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily now, and she's going to talk about her background.
Thank you, Joelle. Joelle and I are very different. I myself have never flushed a fish down the toilet. I was not a fish person, but we have a lot of connections as well in the things that we care about and the values we hold. And I think that simultaneous difference, but similarities it makes a good partnership. So my background is a bit widespread. I got my start in the saltwater marshes of South Carolina in the Low Country, studying amphibians. I was really interested in how road salting might be impacting toad physiology and behavior. If you think about it, when it didn't happen very often in South Carolina, but when we were expecting a freeze, you would put down the road salts, and those road salts generally make their way into puddles or nearby water sources. And those puddles close to the road are ephemeral, they don't last too long. And that is exactly where southern toads like to hang out and lay their eggs. So it was an important question. And I spent a lot of time under fluorescent lights inside, surrounded by aquaria, like staring very hard at a toad in a petri dish and like writing down whether or not it hopped out or not. So it was an interesting study. And from there, I was privileged enough to spend some time in East Africa, where I studied African elephant health across a variety of different land management techniques in Tanzania. And it was there that I learned that, yes, I do love research, but I certainly love field work more than lab work. And I think there are many that would agree with me that spending time up close and personal with elephants does seem to tip the scale a little bit more than like peering intently at toads. And I'm going to just spoiler alert, most of the toads didn't hop, which is, problematic for several reasons. But anyway, so I really fell in love with field work. And I also spent some time working at the zoo in their educational program. I felt like it was really important to immerse myself in more than just research. I wanted to know how I could better communicate that research and just about conservation in general to more people than who I was surrounded with in that ivory tower of academia. During my time there, I fell in love with a particularly charismatic southern ground hornbill, Zazu, who's pictured here. If you could think of like the best concert you've ever been to, like who was frontlining, she's a better performer. I'm telling you, this animal was so charismatic. You could not leave the zoo without having just been, you couldn't walk past her. She was an ultimate performer. So I was surprised. I've always been very mammal biased, and I was not really a big bird person. But one thing that Zazu taught me was that animal personality, when you first kind of like start interacting with it in wild species, is really surprising and engaging. So finally, I ended up in Colorado working in conservation ranching. There, I really focused on learning by doing. And this picture is from one of my favorite snake hibernaculums, where you can just like stick your hand in and grab a couple. And the first time I did that, that was learning by doing. So throughout my travels and studies, I learned a lot, but I realized that my passion was for questions that were really well rooted in how individual animals might help us make sense of kind of larger ecological scale questions. And this brings us to my most recent work, urban coyote behavior in Broomfield, Colorado. I spent the summer of 2019 out in the field, getting to know the system and the coyotes that lived there, jumping around from one city park to the next. The data that I collected and the ensuing analyses culminated in my master's thesis, which was tolerance behaviors in coyotes, Canis latrans, a flexible urban predator, which is great, but I do think that it lends itself to the inevitable question, why do we care about coyote behavior in urban environments? Well, to start with, I care deeply about human or anthropogenic development because it's not going anywhere. The world's population is overwhelmingly urban. And that means that wildlife will either have to suffer extreme habitat loss or figure out how to make do in these altered environments. In addition to this fact, we also know that many wildlife species actually respond to human presence in the same way that they would respond to like a natural predator. And you may be thinking, okay, so what? Well, contemporary research tells us that predation, that top-down control of the food web, can have massive ecosystem-wide implications. So how does predation do this? A really good illustrative example is via the trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is a really powerful ecological mechanism in which a component of an ecosystem's food web is either added or removed, and that has cascading implications for all other species involved. This was actually first coined in aquatic ecosystems, and though I do love what I do, you have to be like a little bit envious of the guy who just got to sit in the boat and watch otters, because otters and kelp was actually one of the first examples, the first really well promoted examples of this trophic cascade. But anyway, a really good terrestrial example of this is actually the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park in the mid-90s. The wolves changed the abundance and behavior of the smaller predators via competition or direct predation, and they actually led to a more diverse plant community because they were able to alter the abundance and behavior of herbivores. So even though the individuals within those herds of herbivores may not have been directly impacted by predation, they changed their behavior because just the threat of wolves was enough. And so their foraging behavior changed, and it led to this really great field of study into the ecology of fear. And this was such an amazing thing. So after the wolves were reintroduced. Researchers found that there were more songbirds, more different types of songbirds. And you may have seen the popular news articles that told you that the wolves changed the course of rivers. And I'm certainly not debating whether or not the trophic cascades can have landscape level impacts, but I do think that those articles kind of wait a little too long to remind the readers that beavers were actually reintroduced in Yellowstone at around the same time. And that does seem like a confounding variable to me personally. But, you know, it does make a really good headline. So while we're still untangling just how wolves impact holistic ecosystems, we do know that the threat of predation can be massively impactful. So bringing it back to humans, knowing that species of wildlife perceive humans as predators, and knowing what we now know about how predation can shape so many aspects of the natural world, this becomes a really important piece to this puzzle of urban ecology. What exactly is the impact of people on wildlife behavior? How may that have cascading impacts on ecosystems? In exploring wildlife's responses to people, we have to know more about how wildlife respond to stimuli in general. In urban areas, many of the species that we're more familiar with as successful urban adapters, so think chipmunks, think raccoons, think house sparrows, they share a key trait, and that is behavioral flexibility. And sometimes we call that plasticity. So these animals do not always respond to the same stimuli the same way, which means they can be really successful in novel environments with a lot of unpredictable stimuli. What is behavioral flexibility, though? Mechanistically, behavioral flexibility is driven by an interaction between genetics and learning. Today, though, we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to focus on that learning component. So how does wildlife learn? In the same way that we do. Think back to learning your times tables. It's all based on repetition. Learning is based on repeated exposure to certain stimuli. So maybe that's your second grade teacher barking out, 9 times 9. Or maybe it's repeated exposure to someone putting out their trash on Wednesdays or walking their dog down a park path. And when we or wildlife species encounter a repeated stimulus, there's either going to be repeated intolerance, which we can call avoidance, or we'll get repeated tolerance. So for those of us who had been practicing, it could be really kind of nice to have like all the eyes on you in the classroom and show off that, yeah, you know what 9 times 9 is, and you're super ready for the next question. Or maybe after the first time you were put on the spot, you started pretending to have the flu so you could spend math class in the nurse's office. In wildlife, when that repeated avoidance happens over time, we call that sensitization. When the repeated tolerance happens over time, we call that habituation, and eventually we get an animal that is habituated. So tolerance to anthropogenic stimuli will either grow and lead to habituation, which is maybe, can't make any scientific claims, but might be represented by a coyote feeling very comfortable to grab somebody else's newspaper, or it will decrease and will lead to sensitization. And I can only imagine that getting chased by a scary dog so many times, eventually that's going to lead to some sensitization process, that negative interaction. And this is a really important thing to think about for an urban predator, because these processes can be really impactful for generating management strategies that keep humans, pets, and wildlife safe. So my main question for this study was how these processes might be impacted by anthropogenic stimuli. So what was mediating this urban coyote behavior? Was it people? Was it dogs? I also wanted to know if I would be able to collect any behavioral data in the first place non-invasively. It was important to me to be as non-invasive as possible, but I had no clue if that was even doable. And I have to say it was a moral obligation. I wanted to be non-invasive. If I was coming in here to learn more about the behavior, it seemed the least I could do was not be really like, I didn't want to be impactful, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't also motivated by the fact that I had very little money and could not have afforded to radio collar these animals. On the ground, I collected data at 6 sites, some of which you may be familiar with if you recreate at all in Broomfield's amazing parks. So some of these parks are open to the public. We have Ridgeview, the field, and we really concentrated in the Ellie's Pond area. There's Broomfield Commons, Metzger Farm. So there are people there doing all of the things that people do in parks, which is, I learned, is so much more than just walking, running, biking, skating. Like the things that happen in these public parks, I was like shocked. There's a lot on. But some of these parks were not public. So Great Western and Future Reservoir were both closed to the public. So I did have some built-in variation in human and therefore dog presence. And we hypothesized that coyote response to anthropogenic stimuli would hinge upon this really important distinction. So maybe coyotes in more active sites where there were people present would be more tolerant of anthropogenic stimuli just because they've been exposed more. But obviously, knowing what we know, there's a flip side to that coin. Maybe in these public parks where there's a lot of human activity, these coyotes are having repeated negative interactions with people, and maybe they're more sensitized. We wanted to find out. But how do we even quantify behavior? In this study, we used a scale developed by Dr. Stuart Breck, who is a veritable superstar if we're talking about urban coyote research, and he has a fantastic history of doing research in the Broomfield area. So basically, we would quantify if and how a coyote fled after seeing us. A 0 meant that the coyote didn't really do anything, it was just hanging out, it didn't seem to really mind that we were watching it, which you could associate with a more tolerant behavior than a 4. If a coyote was assigned a flight behavior score of a 4, that meant that as soon as it saw us, it hightailed out of there. And you can think of that as being a coyote that is highly avoidant of us. So what this really looked like in the field was, especially in the pilot stage of my field season, 9 hours straight of poring over my sites in search of coyotes or even just signs that they were in the area. And this did take practice, as scat can be cryptic, much like social trails. It didn't always pay off, but many times it did. I was able to identify resident coyotes' dens, bedding areas, and pup playgrounds, for lack of a better word, at 3 out of my 6 sites. So what did the data that we collected tell us? The hope was that the flight behavior data we collected would tell me something about whether or not coyotes were avoiding or tolerating anthropogenic stimuli. We did see that there was an inconsistent response across the sites. Each different little row, which is denoted by a specific color, is a different one of our sites. And you can see that there is some variation there. And, you know, as to be expected with field work on mammals, especially predators, our data points could be far and few between. However, we found that there was variation, but presence of dogs and people did not actually influence coyote flight behavior in a statistically significant way. So the presence of dogs and people was not a very good predictor of whether or not coyotes would be more tolerant or if they would flee very quickly and be more avoidant. However, there is some indication that coyotes in the recreational areas of parks did have stronger flight responses comparatively. And those recreational areas, you can just think of that as any area in a park that you can see that's maintained by people. So flower beds, mowed grass. And what that really suggests is that Broomfield Open Space and Trails is doing a really good job, because for the most part, in a lot of these parks with a lot of coyote activity, they keep a mowed buffer around the trails. And if you think about it, if a coyote is in that mowed buffer and they're more likely to flee quickly when they see a human, I think that's probably a coyote that's a lot less likely to be problematic. Additionally, I found that non-invasive studies that are able to differentiate individuals to a statistically relevant level would really require extended periods of time in the field with strong support from well-stocked camera traps. I was unable, in the time frame that I had, which was really just over the summer, that was not enough time to really get to an individual level understanding of these animals in a statistically relevant way. So what? I think this question should feature more prominently in scientific or even academic research. So what? I had my data, I performed my statistical analyses, but something was missing. I just spent all this time in the field with unique individual animals that I could see had personalities, but that wasn't something that I was able to reflect in my scientific manuscript. Okay, so it wasn't something I was really able to factor in statistically, but it still felt inherently meaningful. And I think that's where my collaboration with Joelle is particularly relevant.
All right, so now the moment everyone's been waiting for. So when Emily and I met to collaborate on this book together, we actually didn't know each other. Nest had contacted us and told us that we seemed to have similar interests, that we probably would work well together. So when we met, it kind of felt like a blind date. We met in a cafe and Emily was like, I'll be the one with the blue lunchbox. And we started talking and we were on the same page almost immediately. We both understood that you can throw as many facts about an animal and what we should do to protect them or interact with them or live with them as you want, but we as humans respond emotionally. So the goal of this project from the start was to show that these coyotes are not just this anonymous group that live in and around our community, but they are individuals who think, who feel, and who emote similarly to us and in interesting ways. So as Emily explained, there was a lot of field research because at the start, we weren't actually sure if we were able to identify these individual coyotes, but we knew that we needed to try and that we needed to try to depict them in this more holistic way. So the field work and the research were that first step. And I had never done field research before. So I would like to say that it isn't for the weak of heart. Emily seems to think it's a bit, I mean, it was fun, but it was also very hard. 9-hour shifts in the Colorado sun gave me a new respect for Emily and her group of researchers. And I would join them once a week. They would be out there every day in the sun and the rain, and at times the hail, in which Emily would say, unfortunately, we have to prove what we already know, that coyotes don't come out in the rain. So it was through this that we learned the different groups of coyotes and their different personalities. So White Shoulders, depicted here, was always very exhausted as her pups laid languid in the summer heat, or not, sorry, her pups were not languid, they were bouncing around. There, the next slide. Little Eyebrows, which is in the next slide, named for their white patches above their eyes. We saw Stoic in their stance. They were staring right at me as I photographed them after a hailstorm had passed, standing in the middle of a sidewalk with this very bold pose. And I was just amazed to see it. But I think I probably would have been very scared if I didn't know as much about coyotes or if I had been alone. And then the yearlings were playful and mischievous. They were always trying to entertain themselves. And some of you may be wondering why we didn't just include photographs of these animals within the book. And we were just so grateful to have Jim Kennedy donate that camera to our project, because we were able to take many photographs of them in the field, but because they were very far away, generally they came out when it was a little bit darker because it was a little bit cooler during the dusk and the dawn, and they were constantly in motion. These photographs were not up to a quality that could be used in a book, but they were extremely helpful to use when drawing. So it became more practical because I could stitch information together from various photos in order to create a character study of each individual that we chose to represent, along with that observational information we got from the field. So some of these drawings were conceived because there was a great photograph of the coyotes, and the yearlings photograph was one of them. We were able to photograph them a lot. They were always out. And others were because I had listened to Emily speak about an individual and I knew that it was important to include them within the book. So Dot was one of the latter. She's featured on the cover of the book as well. I only ever saw a flash of Dot when she appeared and disappeared back into the tall grass, and I never saw her again. But Emily spoke fondly of her, as she was the first they could identify as an individual, and she was extremely important to their research because of this. So I knew I needed to include her. And thankfully, Emily was able to provide some better photographs for me to go off of, so that I didn't just have to go off of her description of Dot alone, because Dot is a particularly stunning coyote. Of all of the coyotes, the yearlings were the easiest to represent since they were not afraid of us. They kind of just ignored us. They were bold and were out constantly playing with each other and stalking prairie dogs. And we have many a blurred photograph of them, but thankfully they were easy to replicate from the multitude of photographs that we did take. So what I found most important within these drawings was to capture the personality that these different coyotes possess. If you could advance the slide. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we as humans react emotionally, and it is through forging a personal connection to something that we find the will to protect and adapt to the situation. Therefore, representing these animals as contemplative or bold or playful was a major goal. This is not a book that was created as a list that people could go out into the grasslands and try to check off each individual after they encountered them. Obviously, that would be extremely dangerous to both parties. This was one that sought to forge an emotional connection. And because of this emotional connection and because of its importance, Emily's writing about each coyote was just integral to the creation of this book. She is first and foremost a researcher, a biologist who is able to chase a question to a truthful conclusion. But her writing about each coyote was so personal and beautiful and honest that it helps us to understand a different perspective. And it shows us that she is obviously very passionate about her studies. And this passion is important as well, because it also helps us understand a different perspective so that we may view through a different lens the next time we may see little eyebrows standing on the sidewalk in front of us, causing us to contemplate longer these relationships and our place within them. So we wanted to include an excerpt of the book within our talk. So Emily is going to read it since they are her words.
So this excerpt is about white shoulders pups. It is inevitable for wildlife researchers to feel close to their subjects. You spend hours out in the field tracking them, following them, and mostly just watching them. Some of these moments come easily, but a lot more of them are hard-won. This is always true when it comes to pups. These 3 of 8 are representation of time and effort it takes not only to find a den, but to settle there, to become part of the environment in such a way that a mother and a babysitter alike don't react to your presence. After months of tracking the adults, they had deemed me non-threatening enough to allow my presence. Getting to sit and watch these pups from a distance was a demonstration of trust. A surface level, tenuous trust, but a trust nonetheless. Collecting data on this pack was a constant reminder of that trust and how that was a very heavy thing with layers of latent responsibility. It was my job to collect data, but more than that, it was my job to do right by these animals who could have just as easily slipped among the brambles out of eyesight. Instead, they allowed me to see them. And in doing so, it was also my job to repay that favor. And how can we ever repay that favor to these animals, to all wildlife? In quiet moments spent watching the pups sunbathe or pounce and prod upon each other, you find yourself thinking about that question a lot.
All right. Thank you. That was so beautiful, I think. I hope everyone else agrees. Finally, we wanted to discuss suggestions for living with coyotes, because it would be, we believed, very inappropriate to write this whole book about our wonderful holistic experiences with these animals and how much we cherish and love them, without giving concrete advice to the people of Broomfield on how to have a better relationship with these animals that you can enact today or tomorrow. Because it is with these two things together that we can start to recognize and change our relationship with them. So all of these suggestions for living with coyotes are also available on the Broomfield Open Spaces website. If you are coming in from another area that's not in Broomfield, we would suggest that you contact your own local open spaces department, just because different populations of coyotes respond differently to urban populations, right? So while some of these may apply, some of them may not. So just be aware that those populations are different from this one. But overall, this book was a means of looking at how we as humans can form a more sustainable relationship with the environment. And that starts by responding emotionally to these individuals. And it also starts by giving these concrete suggestions to mitigate the conflict that does occur, because it can be difficult to have any kind of empathy for these animals if you have lost a pet to them. And it can be difficult if you feel a little bit frightened by them. But this is just a starting point, a first step in forging a new relationship. We wanted to ask through this book, what are places within these environments, and how can we learn to live with these animals instead of in spite of them? So I would like to say, before we go into the question period, if you would like to view a digital copy of this book, you may do so by visiting my website. It's just my name, joellecicak.com, so C-I-C-A-K for the last name. And under the works and paper section, there is a Coyotes of Broomfield page, and there's a PDF that is available to download so that you can have your very own digital copy. We wanted to make this book as accessible to the public as possible, so they are free to own digitally. And we are currently working with the library as well as Broomfield Open Spaces to help give hard copies to the public. COVID kind of slowed that process down a little bit. So hopefully we'll start distributing them this summer as well. So I think Emily has some homework for you all.
You know, I think in the interest of time, I think I'm more interested in hearing questions and leaving some space for that.
All right.
So why don't we jump to these really blurry photographs that are exemplify why we needed Joelle for many other reasons beyond the fact that sometimes cameras are tough.
They're pretty good photographs. I think I used one of them as a reference for drawing, actually. So.
Yeah, so Kristen, I'm not sure how the questions are facilitated. Would you guys like for us to stop sharing?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about your photos, I mean, I think that's fine. There is time for that, Emily, if you would like to.
Okay. Yeah, so we did have a little bit of homework to give people. You know, it just felt right. Give you guys a little bit of a taste of field work. So I'm charging you all with these 3 tasks. I would love for you to find an individual. And I'm talking about a member of a wildlife species. I think if you choose your cat or your dog, that is cheating. I won't know. So. Yeah, but you'll know. So I would ask that you spend some time getting to know each other and think about this animal in terms of, you know, how would you be able to recognize this bird, this squirrel, this rabbit, if you were to come across it again? And that might be, what does it look like physically? Are there any splotches on it? Is its ear notched? But it also could be behaviorally. What is it doing? How is it conducting itself? What is the gestalt? And then I I would encourage you to sketch what you see and what you feel. I am certainly not an artist of the same caliber as Joelle. I'm Joelle's biggest fan. I think there are a few that are of her caliber, but I still think it's so important to connect your eyes to your hands. And sometimes then once that connection happens, your brain kind of catches up a little bit. And I know that my field journal is littered with horrible, atrocious sketches. But so that is what I ask of you all to take with you here. And I also like to end public talks with book recommendations. If this was something that piqued your interest, which I hope on some level it did. I have 2 books to recommend, and Joelle has put out 2 books. So one is The Rambunctious Garden by Emma Maris. There's Where the Wild Things Were by William Stolzenberg. We have Braiding Sweetgrass up here by Robin Wall Kimmerer that Joelle has suggested. And Joelle has also suggested Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. So that is actually the end of our talk, and we were hoping to kind of get to questions here. These are photographs that we took at 2 different sites. The one on the right is actually kind of what inspired the excerpt from about white shoulders pups. But yeah, so I think we'll wrap it up there. And then Kristen, should we just moderate the chat?
I can read the questions to you. They're under Q&A on
Sure.
the bar at the base of the screen there. So Tara asked, hi, Joelle and Emily, thank you for this. My question, could you please talk about what each of you found from the other? As a research artist and as a research scientist, how did this collaboration change your understanding of your own work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you, Tara. I think it was really important, actually for me, that Joelle helped solidify my work. I had always been a little bit, I think traditional ecology research was always like, don't name your subjects, nothing is fluffy or cute. That's anthropomorphizing to think that things have personality. Like that's just not really, and that's not the world that I lived in. So of course things are changing now, and there's kind of an awakening, like, and a realization that like, what's the harm in naming your study animals? In fact, like, it seems that we've been biased in the wrong direction for quite some time. So getting to do this project with Joelle specifically was a really good kind of confirmation that we're going in the right direction in terms of how we perceive these animals, because scientifically we know personality exists. It's just about, how do we shift perceptions and our own latent perceptions. So Joelle was immensely helpful for that, for me.
Yeah, and I actually felt the same way. I felt that very validated by a lot of what the conversations that Emily and I had, both in the field and when we were formulating this project. She gave me a really awesome reading list as well. Because I definitely, it is very difficult to actually find writing about animals within the art sphere where animals aren't used as symbol. And there's nothing wrong with using animals as symbol, but that's just not something that I am interested in doing within my own practice. So it was really helpful actually to get that reading list from Emily. That was a more, because scientific writing can be very difficult to read, especially if you're not a scientist, and I'm not a scientist. But also I really learned a lot from the research in the field, and just having the chance to spend 9 hours at a time watching these animals and learning from the way that these biologists did work. Because oftentimes art can sometimes feel like a pseudoscience, like you're making things up. And that doesn't always feel great. So being able to actually work on this project where I wasn't making things up and I had this really strong foundation and was able to have all of these really meaningful conversations about ecology with Emily instead of just doing kind of this one-sided research and hoping that the information I was finding was accurate was really, really wonderful.
Okay, Karen has this question. What did Open Space learn from your field studies? And I think we're still kind of trying to get our heads around a lot of the research that Emily has done and to understand some of the findings. And so Pete and Jack, please jump in. But one thing I want to say is that I think, oh gosh, when did we do the coyote policy? It was quite a few years ago. And the concept of coexistence with these animals was important to our community. And just hearing Emily and Joelle speak about their personal and professional connections to the environment, to wildlife, to their art and research, I think our Broomfield citizens, residents, were on the right track with looking at our wildlife, and in this case, particularly coyotes, through that lens. And I think there was a mention of how important taking conservation and those ideas and communicating about conservation to your community is really an important action. And I think we have a lot of volunteers that help with that. The nature program, the Open Space Foundation, and all of that work. Sometimes you wonder, does it really build understanding? Personally, I do think it does. And it's just something that really needs to be continually pursued. So Pete, you want to add anything, or Jack? We are going to be digging into the results of the research in more detail. But any other thoughts you want to add right now?
Yeah, thank you. I think for us, just the documentation of the truly unique and different personalities. I think sometimes as land managers, we want coyotes to be predictable and we want to understand how they're going to act in different situations. And I think their study really reinforced that coyotes, like humans, really are unique, and we should not expect uniform behavior. And some coyotes in the same circumstances will display different types of behavior and boldness, and in some cases, or the opposite in other cases. And so I think as land managers, we have to continue to try to understand that. And I do think the research is helpful. I think it will continue to be helpful. Emily and Joelle also assembled a lot of trail cams out in our open space that are still out there and working now. And so we continue to, collect data from the trail cams and learn from that too. So
I will say though, I mean, if anyone knows what happened to my one missing trail cam, speak now. There will be no repercussions. We just want to know where she is. But I also think it's worth noting that one of my favorite sayings about coyotes is that a coyote loves nothing more than to prove a human wrong. And so that's kind of, just this whole project, and like part of managing coyotes is recognizing that. So much credit to Broomfield Open Space and Trails, because that is not an easy kind of animal to work with. It looks like Molly is asking, from the academic perspective, how do your academic advisors react to this collaboration of research and art? For example, I loved Emily's comment about so what. My academic advisor, Dr. Joanna Lambert, is amazing, fantastic. And if anything, that attitude has kind of via osmosis, I have like absorbed it. She is an absolutely fantastic researcher who's incredibly integrated with a really good understanding of that kind of, well, so what? And her work in East Africa has been like fundamental to the development of like entire national parks, which is just kind of amazing. If you think about like Uganda's Yellowstone, but she in part is the reason why that exists. So I think I'm very lucky to follow in a trail of scientists that have been asking so what for quite some time.
Yeah, and I mean, in the arts, we all have our own research. I think you can't make art that's just about art. I mean, I guess you can, but why would you? So I think most artists have research. Their research is based in another subject, in another field, whether it be like architecture, or it could be in the sciences or religion, or history. So this is kind of just my academic advisors were like, yeah, this is a thing that you should be doing. You should be working with these other people. It's pretty, I think it's not as uncommon as we think it is for artists to do things like this. So there was a positive support network there as well.
Okay, this person has a question. Coyote populations seem to be strong. Is anything done to control the populations, or is this necessary? So I'll respond to that, and then I think if others want to join in, that's fine. In Broomfield, we have a specific coyote policy that we worked on with the community and several major researchers in the country to advise us on this. This was somewhat of a new effort for us at the time. We worked closely with the community, our Open Space and Trails Advisory Committee, and the City Council, and the biologists. I think what we've found is that coexistence is really the proper, appropriate way to respond to coyotes in your community. They are throughout the entire Front Range. They are in many, many places from New York to San Francisco. So this is not unusual. As far as controlling the population, no, we don't do that in the sense of culling them or killing them just because we have a perception that there might be too many. Our policy does also take into consideration public health and safety, and that's also a very important aspect of the policy. And in that case, if we were to have a bite to a human by a coyote, or a very aggressive action to a human being, then we would investigate that situation. And in certain situations, the coyote could be put down. So in those types of public health safety type of issues, that would be how we would respond to that situation. And our goal in that type of conflict is to really try to focus in on that particular coyote that caused that action and to look at the specific facts related to the event. And so it's not something we would do on a regular basis. It's in response to a very serious conflict with a human. Anybody else want to add anything else?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Just quickly on that, coyotes are quite good at regulating their own population too. They're very particular about who gets to mate and breed, and they protect their territories. They also have a pretty high mortality, we found, mainly due to car strikes, unintentional poisoning in some cases. So there's a pretty high mortality rate and a self-regulated breeding. So we really don't have to ever get involved in terms of managing the population. I do think, there's times where we have to get involved because of what Kristen mentioned, if we have a true outlier in terms of behavior. So.
Two questions here. How many coyotes in Broomfield die every year from vehicle strikes and rodenticides? Is there some data on this? Pete, I know we've had some necropsies that have indicated several coyotes have died from poisoning rodents that they've ingested. I'm not sure how many have, I don't think we have data on this that's very comprehensive. But there are a fair number that are hit by cars, and I think we found that can be pretty high mortality rate. Pete, you want to add some more?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we really don't have data on either of those metrics, but when we were testing coyotes, we were finding poisoning in some of the coyotes that we picked up and we did necropsies on. We're hoping that those levels are going down. The substances that were available for rodent control 5 years ago and 10 years ago, many of them are no longer on the market. We've made a lot of improvements in that area. And so those rodenticides that are passed on to coyotes are typically no longer on the market. So we're expecting the poisoning to go down. Vehicle strikes, I think, is quite common. I think this is a very small data set, but in Broomfield, one summer we had 6 coyotes collared. I know that 3 of those coyotes died from car strikes. So that is a common cause of death. I don't have specific data on how many though.
Okay, another question. Can you elaborate on the reasons to avoid feeding or befriending coyotes?
Is it okay if I start with this one? But I think for certain that Broomfield Open Space and Trails should finish it.
We will.
Yeah, I figured. So we talked a lot in the beginning about that habituation process. And I alluded to the fact that it's really important for us to know about these processes such that management can be informed. And the reason is because a habituated coyote is not one that you want in your neighborhood. And it's interesting because throughout our like history of the American West, you read books, you see stories of like, oh, we have a coyote as a pet, we took it in as a pup. That is highly, highly problematic, not just because of at an individual level, it's a wild animal. It's not a domesticated animal, it's just a habituated animal, and there are a lot of behavioral differences there. It's also problematic because it is promoting a value set that I myself would not want to promote, which is that these animals only exist for us to befriend, and that it is okay to do so for other people. Because even if you might have a specific instance where you aren't hurt, but in doing so, you're promoting this such that in the future somebody else might get hurt, which I think is a little bit more impactful than saying, but values. But I'll pass it off to open space and trails.
Well,
Sure, thanks, Emily. I mean, I
So-
don't think.
Go ahead, Pete.
I'm sorry. I don't think we have too much to add, but feel free to jump in, Kristen. I think our standpoint is that we enjoy, even if we enjoy coyotes, which many of us do. I go out in the open space. I love to see them, but if I'm ever close to them, I don't let them know that I like to see them. Wave my arms and make noises and try to scare them away, because I know ultimately that's what's best for them. And that's really what we encourage at a community level in neighborhoods. If you see them in your front yard, if you see them in your driveway, it's okay to scare them off. Even if you enjoy seeing them, it's better for them to have an inherent fear of humans for their own survival.
Mhm. Yeah, I second all that. And I guess I would just maybe provide a concrete example where you really could be creating a problem. If you're say at a park and you just love sitting on the park bench and feeding a coyote your sandwich at lunch, like putting out little pieces and seeing if it will come close to you. Well, the next time maybe a family goes there and they have a small child that's eating a sandwich, and the coyote thinks that's what you do. You go and you grab that sandwich. You could really cause a terrible, terrible conflict, and a human being could be hurt, and the coyote could be hurt too. So I hope that makes sense. It really is not what you want to do. An appreciation from afar, following the homework that Emily gave us, and really observing, for example, a coyote and looking at it from far and trying to understand it. I mean, I think that would be a much better use of time and very much more in line with a coexistence value that we have in Broomfield.
There's also a pretty chilling fact that I'm sure that all of Open Space and Trails is already aware of. The majority of coyote attacks are on children. These are really cute animals. They're amazing animals, but that doesn't mean they're not dangerous in the wrong situations. They're not always dangerous, but when they are dangerous, it's for children. And when attacks do happen, even in scientific articles about them, it's chilling. So this is not like a dog growled at my child. It's more intense than that. So, anything we can do to avoid having to read more about that, it would be lovely.
Another one of our open space colleagues, Marianne Bonnell, works for Jefferson County Open Space. Maybe you saw her on TV last night speaking about rattlesnakes. She was outstanding. She's really well known for her knowledge of coyotes. And, I think I've heard her say many times that oftentimes, not in every case, but oftentimes when you have very serious conflicts between people and coyotes, it is due to some feeding going on in the area. And when we hear about a hotspot in Broomfield, that is one of the first things we start investigating, trying to see, is there unintentional feeding going on where somebody's leaving a bowl of pet food out on their back porch, but it's bringing coyotes into people's yards more. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that feeding can often really be the impetus for those conflicts we want to avoid. We do have another question here from Tara, a follow-up question, if it's useful. How have you both navigated the anthropomorphic descriptions we see in Disney movies?
Joelle, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I think something that, I mean, Disney movies are obviously the extreme example, right? They make every animal into dogs, whether it's a horse or a chameleon. And, you know, I think that can be a little bit problematic because animals do think and act and emote, but they are not like dogs. But I think that it's actually not correct. Our views of anthropomorphism are starting to come under question. That some things we think are anthropomorphizing are actually these things that we attribute to being only human emotions or only human reactions are actually not human at all. They're shared amongst many species of animals. Emily was talking about Zazu, the bird that she worked with like, was a ham for attention. He loved to get attention and would do whatever he could to make people laugh. So that's obviously then not a human thing if a bird is doing it as well. There actually are two really awesome books that are academic reads that I would point you to if you're interested in reading more about this. And the first is Vibrant Matter. It's a book by Jane Bennett. And she describes kind of this way of equalizing our way of thinking about different forms of life and even inanimate objects and the way we kind of respond and react to them. And another book that I would suggest, though it is a little dense, is When Species Meet by Donna Haraway, where she talks about her relationship with her dog. And she also has a very long passage about Barbara Smuts' studies on baboons and the way that Barbara Smuts learned to interact with these baboons to actually get more meaningful data from them. And these two books are all about how we kind of misinterpret what anthropomorphism really is and how we kind of need to start learning to respond to animals differently with a more equal gaze.
Certainly. I also think that for a specific case study, Bambi is a really interesting one to focus on because on the one hand, I do think that exposing so many people to that kind of empathy and feeling like that for wildlife actually did do some really amazing things. I think it kind of led to a reduction in like mass toxin use for a lot of animals, just because people started thinking about them differently. But on the other side, massively detrimental. We need to be shooting more deer. Deer are insanely invasive. They are really, really bad for forests. They completely remove understudies. There's been a lot of work done on how deer have kind of like, white-tailed deer are kind of just like a bomb, and then all the biodiversity is like gone because of what they eat. So it's interesting because it certainly is a double-edged sword. There's a lot of power inherent to it. And sometimes I think that there are unintended consequences. Now, all of us are like, there are some of us that might think like, oh, hunting a deer, like that's Bambi's dad. That could be Bambi's mom. And it's like, no, even Bambi should probably be, if not ethically and humanely removed, at least translocated somewhere else. So it's an interesting thing to grapple with.
Right. I think we've neared the end of our time here. Thank you so much. I want to let you know that the Broomfield Open Space Foundation provides a donation to the nonprofit of your choice. And Joelle and Emily have chosen Coyote Project in San Francisco. And we were kind of talking about that before the presentation. Camille Fox with that organization was one of our first speakers that we had here in Broomfield. And she was really well received and provided a lot of wonderful information on coyotes for our community. So thank you for supporting her. That's a great organization, and tell her hello from us, okay?
Will do.
Thank you tonight. I do want to mention, unfortunately, our April 28th presentation, the Summit Songs and Science Project with Dr. Uliana Horodisky, has to be canceled. She had a family emergency come up, has to be away at that time. And so we are going to try to reschedule Uliana for the fall for a session then. But again, I think that will be very interesting, and I'm sorry that won't be occurring on April 28th. Thank you all tonight for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you, Emily and Joelle. And we look forward to the book release that we'll plan here soon, okay? With the library. Should be very fun. Thank you all for attending tonight. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.